Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, President of AG Financial Insurance Solutions, and I'm a certified risk manager. And once again, we have Rich Hammer here with us. He is an attorney, a CPA, a Harvard Law graduate, and a best-selling author in regards to church law and church tax. And we're just so happy to have him here with us. And we're going to talk about volunteers and how volunteers can affect your ministry and how we can protect the volunteers themselves. So, and what we need to do. But if you guys have questions out there, what we want you to be able to do is ask us questions. So if you'll go right down below where you're watching this film, you can type in a question, and that question will actually come up on our computer here so we can answer your questions, because that's a large part of this. We want to make sure that we're being of service to you and helping you. Also, if you'll go to the right of the screen and give us your email address, what we'll be able to do is give you updates and the resources that we are commenting on here during this seminar. We'll actually get to you as soon as we're done with this seminar. So with that, let's talk about volunteers and how we select, supervise volunteers, and the importance of all the volunteers in the church.
Well, Jerry, you know, when you think about it, our focus today is on volunteers, and the typical church has probably 20, 30, maybe 50 times more volunteers than they do paid employees. So there are many issues associated with volunteers, and there's so many of them that kind of magnifies the importance of what we're talking about. And we're going to talk about several of those issues today, and the first one is going to be on screening and selecting those volunteers. That's a very important issue, and it seems daunting. We have to screen 100 volunteers or 200 or 300 or 400 volunteers. It seems like an overwhelming responsibility. But the bottom line is, as you well know, that churches can be liable legally for the actions of those volunteers. And so it's very important, I think, for churches, before you put a person in a position as a volunteer, to vet that person, to screen that person, and to avoid the accusation that the church is liable on the basis of negligent selection for the activity of that person. Now, negligence is a legal term that simply means carelessness or a failure to exercise reasonable care. And the way that we see this come up in the church context with volunteers is in a number of ways, but I think most importantly, the whole issue of sexual misconduct with minors is number one, because you didn't screen this volunteer or these volunteers that you're putting in the youth group or in children's ministry. And another common one would be drivers. Volunteers that are selected by the church to drive, maybe children, maybe youth, without properly vetting them. Those are two common examples of negligent selection. So we've come up over the years with a number of steps that churches can take to rebut the allegation that you were negligent in selecting workers. Let me just mention 6 of those for you. And feel free to jump in here, Jerry. But number one would be, of course, an interview. If the person is not well known, for example, if the person was born and raised in your church, you know, the interview may be not important. But if it's a relatively new person to the community, maybe a student at a local college, I think an interview is important just to get a feeling for who is this person and to assess his or her fitness and suitability to serve as a volunteer. And then a written application form that elicits a number of items of information. Most importantly, in my opinion, where have you worked in the past as a volunteer? And in particular, if they're going to be working with children or minors in your church, where have you worked with minors? For example, maybe you were a coach of a little league team or a soccer team. Maybe you worked with scouts. Maybe you worked in another church as a youth worker. There are a number of venues in which people can work with minors. And it's very important to get that information on that written application. But just getting the information in and of itself is worthless. You got to do something with that, and that's the next step in our 6-step process, and that's checking references. And Jerry, I've seen a lot of churches, I think, err here, where they ask the volunteer applicant, give us the name of 2 or 3 references, and they put down names of people you've never heard of before, live in different states, and those references are next to worthless. In fact, they're maybe worse than worthless. They're dangerous, because according to the FBI profile on child molesters, the only adult friends of most child molesters are other child molesters. So what good are recommendations from those people that you don't know? So when I say references, I mean institutional references. Where have you worked with minors? That's why we ask that question on the application form. And then you follow up and you contact those other institutions where this person has worked with minors for a recommendation. Is this person fit or suitable for working with minors? Do you know of any reason why that would not be true?
One of the things that I know that we will make available to every one of our churches is the volunteer application that we use for volunteers if someone is going to volunteer for a church, and also the reference check form that we have available that will ask those 3 or 4 questions that they need to ask every single person. This form could actually be sent to a person, or it can actually be called and just written out by the person that is taking the information. I get several calls a year because of them knowing who I am, of people that are volunteering, and the same people will call me and ask for references. So it's the same questions, but it's real important to have those and to keep those on file in case you're ever named in a lawsuit.
Oh, that is so true. I have found in my surveys I've done of church practices that, that's absolutely right. And to your point of how long do you keep those references?
Permanently.
That's permanent, yeah. There are some records that the church needs to keep permanently. This is one of them because of the so-called discovery rule, where victims of child abuse can sometimes, the statute of limitations doesn't begin to run until they realize that their psychological damages were caused by that abuse when I was 6 or 8 or 10 years old at church, and that can be decades in the future. I've dealt with a case recently where an accusation of child molestation came forth by somebody who claimed that he was abused in a church in 1977. And so I asked the church, get your policy for that year. Well, where in the world is it? You know, from that many years ago. That is vital information.
One of the other things that they need to do, besides just keeping the volunteer application and the references, and you just mentioned it right there, is make sure that they keep a copy of their policy, insurance policy that they have showing liability coverage. How many cases have we seen where we go back to the 1980s or previously, and the insurance company said, we have no knowledge of this. You've got to prove to that insurance company that you purchased this coverage for them, you know, or from them. So keep those insurance policies, especially for liability insurance, permanently also.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think it would be well, like you say, to make a copy and have that in a different location. So if there's a disaster, a hurricane, a tornado, a fire, you're going to still have a copy of that and safeguarded, hopefully in a storm-proof, fire-proof facility of some sort. And of course, you can scan it and digitize this information and keep it on off-site computers. Let's go to a 4th step that churches can take in our 6-step basic plan, and that's what we call the 2-adult rule. That doesn't mean 2 adults present at all times when children are around, but it does mean that a volunteer worker, youth worker, or children's worker is never alone with one child. There's got to be 2 people if there's 1 child. You can have multiple children with 1 adult. Look at your local public school down the street. Go to the 2nd grade classroom. What do you see? Typically 1 teacher, 30 or 40 students. That's the state policy in your state in most cases. That doesn't violate the 2-adult rule. So we're not, I think sometimes churches place upon themselves a burden that's not only heavy, but it's unworkable, and that puts you in the worst possible position because you have a policy that you can't implement or enforce, and that's going to be Exhibit A in a lawsuit against your church. Now, the 5th precaution is the 6-month rule. And by that I mean, we don't allow volunteers to work with minors who have not been a member of our church for a minimum of 6 months. Gives you a chance to know this person rather than putting people to work with kids that come in off the street. And then the 6th and final recommendation here to rebut the finding of negligent selection would be a criminal records check. You can use the term background check, but that includes a variety of things, including the reference checks we just talked about. But in addition to that, we recommend a criminal records check that includes a check of the sex offender registry and that's the nsopw.gov website, National Sex Offender Public website, nsopw.gov, that you can look at all 50 state child abuse sex offender registries and see if the person that wants to teach third grade Sunday school in your church is on a registry. Don't just look at your state registry. Look at all 50 states. They'll have color photos of people by name. You don't need their permission to do this. It's free and it's instantaneous. That's at a minimum what you need to do. But we also recommend you go beyond that and do the National Criminal File criminal records check to do an additional component, because the sex offender registry only pertains to certain crimes. So those are the 6 things that we believe, and this is based on experience and a review of all pertinent litigation, put you in a position that's defensible. That yes, we cannot protect or we can't prevent this from happening, child molestation at the church, but we can put our church in a position where we're managing and reducing that risk by taking steps such as these.
Rich, we got a question that just came in, and basically what the question is we have people that regularly attend our church, and they actually volunteer in with children. Do we have to follow the 6-month rule, and do they have to be members?
I would highly recommend that. There's no right or wrong answer to that question, as you know, Jerry. It's a question of risk. How much risk are you willing to assume? I often put it this way. Just imagine that in some prominent place in your church lobby, you have a giant risk meter that's about 10 feet square. And there's this needle. And over here is low risk. Over here is high risk. You get to choose the placement of that needle by the answer to questions. So, well, we're going to use a volunteer. Here's a college student that has been in our community for 6 weeks. And we don't know him, but he wants to teach a Sunday school class for kindergartners. We're going to, what do we want to wait 6 months for? He's eager to get started. The needle's coming this way, to high, if you use him. Most people want that needle on this side, where your risks are low, not just for personal injury, but also for church liability. So I believe the standard should be membership for 6 months. That puts you in the best position from a risk standpoint.
Okay. I know that a lot of churches don't actually keep active membership rolls, and sometimes people will attend church for several years and people know them, but they're not members of the church. Mm-hmm. In that case, what it does is just brings that meter back a little bit more from somebody attending less than 6 months. Yes. But I guess each church will be their own guide in that situation.
And I'm sensitive to that question, Jerry, that some churches really do. It's common to have people that for whatever reason decide not to become full-fledged members of the church, and yet they've attended for years. Absolutely, you make an exception in a case like that for long-term members. Where you cut off that line, that's up to the church. The longer, the better.
Sounds good.
And then let's go ahead and move on to a related issue. We've talked about selection of these volunteer workers. Another issue is the supervision of those volunteers, because a church can actually be liable for not just being negligent or careless in selecting the volunteer, but in negligently supervising the volunteer or an activity in which volunteers work. So for example, you want to have an adequate number of properly qualified workers at church events, especially those involving youth. So for an example a common example would be water events, where you take the youth group to the lake or to the ocean or to a swimming pool swimming. If it's a facility without trained lifeguards on duty, which is always my recommendation, that you limit these events to those locations, then you impose upon yourself a duty to have trained personnel that are CPR qualified. Jerry, how many times have we seen children or youth that drown and can't be resuscitated at a church event because there was no qualified person present? And you stand there and watch that child die. Another very important point here with regard to proper supervision is checking with other charities. That was one of the findings in the Penn State case involving Jerry Sandusky, the so-called Free report. Louis Free, the former FBI director, he was in charge of a committee that came up with about 120 recommendations for Penn State with regard to their very frequent involvement with minors on that campus. They had summer camps, they had all kinds of programs that brought minors onto the campus. And the Free report came up with 120 recommendations. One of them was comparability analysis. And by that they meant constantly compare your policies with those of other charities. So for churches, you know, the best comparison would be to your public schools, because that's a state agency. So what the policies in your public schools would be represent what your state determines to be a minimum standard of care. So if your church aligns with those practices, how can you be liable? How can you be guilty of negligence? But I still recommend you go beyond the public schools. You start there, but check with a couple of other national youth-serving charities that have affiliates in your community, such as YMCA summer camps, such as Red Cross, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, etc. And then, with regard to proper supervision of volunteers and activities in which they participate in, Jerry, let's talk for a few minutes about ultra-hazardous activities.
Okay.
You might touch base on that.
Well, and actually we had a couple cases that have came in. One was in regards to a hayride. We did have a church that had a hayride, and was not a planned activity of the church, but some of the church volunteers decided they were at the camp, let's hire the next door neighbor to do a hayride. And while they were doing the hayride, a couple individuals fell off the wagon.
Well, didn't it kind of go in a rut?
It did. Actually, it hit the side of the road, which caused the back wheel to drop down. And when that happened, it plopped him off. The individual that had the hayride actually had the minimum state limits for the claim, which was $25,000 here in the state of Missouri. The claim was over $400,000. Fortunately, the church came in and we were able to cover the church, and the church had liability insurance for the additional amount. But because of what happened, the church was held liable for this, even though there was a total third party driving the vehicle and that was responsible for the hayride. Let me give you another example that we had, which actually is one of the largest claims that we've had in regards to an AG church. And that happened at a fall harvest party. And that was with an inflatable, and it was in proper supervision again.
Describe inflatables.
Well, it was an inflatable where the little kids all get to go in and jump up and have fun.
On water, on a lake?
No, this was not on a lake. This was actually inside the gymnasium of the church. Okay. As they were, they hand out candy and all that sort of stuff. To bring the people in, they had some inflatables. And what they did was they actually had this inflatable, hired a third party that had the inflatable. What they didn't realize is they signed a waiver when they rented the inflatable, saying that they'd be held responsible. A person actually, it was a 3-year-old kid, actually ended up with broken body parts to the tune of it was over $1 million claim. The person that attended the church says, we're not going to sue the church. Church felt like there was no issue. A year later, the lawsuit against the inflatable company was settled for over $1 million. The inflatable company then sued the church because of the agreement they had signed and said, church, you pay us. Now you imagine this. When there is a claim on an insurance policy, you're supposed to notify the insurance company immediately. The lawsuit has already taken place. You weren't even part of it, and you're coming back to the insurance company and saying, please hold us, please take care of us. And they're saying, you didn't notify us of the claim to begin with, we're not going to cover you. That was the first thing. The nice thing is the insured, the church, had a letter from the claimant saying, we're not going to sue you. And therefore, they did not see any reason to send that in. And that actually upheld in court, and the church was held responsible for it.
Jerry, that's a number of important points there, but top of the list is that failure to notify. That if churches, if you would look at your general liability insurance policy, buried in that legalese is a provision that says you have a duty to notify the insurance company, not just of actual claims where you've gotten a demand letter from an attorney, but potential claims. And the failure to comply with that can result in the loss of coverage under the policy. I've seen this happen many times. Now, generally, the courts have ruled for that to work, there's got to be prejudice to the insurance company. And in your case, obviously, the insurance company was not prejudiced by that failure to notify. But it's very important. I talk to church leaders all the time that describe for me a scenario that is clearly a potential claim, and they ask me what do they need to do, and I have a checklist of things I go over, but at the top of that list is notify your insurance company because this is a potential claim. You don't want to run into a failure to notify defense to coverage.
Rich, I know that we're not going to probably get through this whole litany of volunteer information that we have for people, so we're probably going to have to make this 2 different sessions just because so many
or more.
So many things we want to cover, and we're getting a lot of questions that would actually are based on what we're talking about now. So
Can
let's
I insert something here
Sure.
before you go to the questions? Let's talk about one more ultra-hazardous activity, maybe 2.
Okay.
How about pyrotechnics?
Wow.
You know, replicating the gunfight at the OK Corral in the church parking lot, or the Battle of Iwo Jima with explosives. I've seen these things happen. I can't believe it. What about rope rappelling? Can you believe that? 10-year-old kids going down 100-foot cliffs with a rope? Ay, ay, ay. I mean, it happened in my church, and a rope broke, and the kid fell about 80 feet onto rocks at the bottom, and he got up unscathed. His mother said, I believe it was a miracle.
I believe it is.
So, you know, why send kids over a cliff with, you know, 10-year-old boys? Or how about this? Boy, how many claims have we seen for this? Trampolines. Yes, the kids want trampolines. They want to play on trampolines. The risk is, look at the American Medical Association this week, Jerry, recommended that whatever benefit you get from trampoline use, it's outweighed by the risks. There are humongous risks associated with trampolines. You get kids, go to a church member's home for a sanctioned youth activity, and they see a trampoline in the backyard. It's like a magnet. The kids are back there before you can even stop them. And there's 15 of them on that thing jumping up and down. They don't know what they're doing. They're untrained. There's nobody supervising. And one of them hits his head on the rim, and he becomes a quadriplegic for life at age 10. I am sick and tired of seeing those claims. Trampolines, in my opinion, are another example of a hazardous activity.
Well, let's take a couple questions here, and it's the first one is, Rich, this issue becomes even more challenging with volunteers who are immigrants. How would you handle that?
Oh, that's good. That's a good. I get asked that question increasingly, as you might expect, and the answer is this: just because somebody's new to this country doesn't mean happy days are here again. We don't have to do anything with regard to vetting this person's fitness and suitability to work in our church. Well, what do you do? You know, you can't do a criminal records check in America, but the fact is there are a number of organizations that permit you to do criminal records checks overseas. One of them is LexisNexis, which is the successor to
Volunteer Select.
Volunteer Select, right. And they do, on their website, you can see they have dozens and dozens of countries where you can do criminal records checks. Now, they're a little more expensive than US based. I'd say they run from $50 to $100, but you're not going to have that many people that are going to have to have these checks. That's number one. Number two is getting a reference from the home country of this individual. Maybe that person's home church would be ideal. And again, asking ultimately if they're going to be working with minors, are you aware of any reason why this person would not be suitable to work with minors in our church? You may have to have that translated into that foreign language, whatever that might be, Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, whatever. But that can be done, and those are just some additional steps that can be taken. But the bottom line is this: you need to do something. There was a case recently, Jerry, $7 million settlement in a case involving an 81-year-old immigrant from a Central American country. And he had only been in the United States a year. He was working in a Head Start program, molests 4 children. And the argument was the Head Start program, operated in a church, was negligent because they didn't do a background check on this guy in his home country. They said at a minimum you should have gotten references from his home country. And the fact is, you need to do more than that. You should also do that criminal records check. And I'm talking about people that have been here for a short period of time. At 2, 3, 4 years, you're going to probably want to do both, a foreign country check plus a U.S. check, because they have enough, they've lived here long enough.
One of the important things too with that is that actually getting those reference checks, that's when those reference checks become just as important as that background check, because there may not be good information out there. But you may actually, instead of getting 2 references, get 4 references. At least you're trying to do your due diligence as a church.
Yes, yeah. And you remember what I said? be careful about those personal references, because those can be dangerous, people you don't know. Some people have never worked with minors before, and so you can't have an institutional reference to contact. But in that case, you're left with personal references. And in that limited case, I recommend you limit the references to members of your church.
Well, we have another really good question here. What do you do for volunteers who come from a different church to help during a multi-church event?
Well, obviously, the first thing you would do, and the most important thing, would be to contact the person's home church to see if that person has been properly screened by that church. And in many cases, if it's especially involving youth activities, that has been done. If it hasn't been done, that is a risk that has to be addressed.
One of the things that we do is actually I would do an affidavit to that church to be signed off on by the pastor that they know of no reason that the volunteers that they are using pose any threat to children, and that they do background checks and reference checks on their volunteers.
I highly recommend that.
Sounds good. Another question we already have. We have a school and one of our male teachers is taking 3 boys to Friday night movies. Are we still liable if anything were to happen if it were not a school-sanctioned event?
Possibly. I will say this, if it has no, it's not on the church calendar, it's not a church-sanctioned event, you would have a good argument that what that guy does on his own private time, even with youth members of your church, that's a kind of a break in the liability that the church might have. But that's not a 100% guarantee, because attorneys will try to point out there's enough of an association there to tie in the church. For example, did the pastor or other church leaders realize that he was doing this? You know, he met the kids, he formed a relationship with them at the church. Does that not carry over? You know, there's an argument to be made that kind of behavior, the church needs to be aggressive in advising people not to be doing that. When you talk about an adult taking 3 children to movies, I mean, my red flags go up like crazy, because that's starting to describe Jerry Sandusky at Penn State, who, if you look at the grand jury report, it's a litany of what is called grooming behavior, of things that he would do. Take these kids to Penn State football games, away and at home. Let them sit on the bench with the team, you know, lavishing them with all kinds of gifts. That grooming behavior that is seducing children, forming a relationship with them, and sometimes with their parents, is something that raises a red flag.
Absolutely. Well, I know that we're not going to have time to get through everything that we have here, but what I think we're going to have to do is actually come back to this subject next month. And then in the future, we're going to actually be doing one of the most frequently asked questions that I'm getting right now is, what do we do with concealed carry? So we're going to be talking about that in the near future also. Meaning
concealed weapons permits.
Correct.
And how a church should respond to that issue. We see just an explosion in the number of people buying firearms in this country today, unprecedented numbers. And yet you have many of these people asking, if some of them don't ask, can I carry my concealed weapon onto church premises? And what should a church's response be to that?
Yeah, and that's going to be coming up in the near future. So again, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your time and your knowledge in doing this Risk Management Live. We're here to be of service to you, and actually what you can do right now is actually go to the right of your screen, sign up for future information. We will send you the resources we talked about, like the applications and reference checks. Those forms will be sent to you just because you've watched this and you signed up to the right. You'll also get the exact date and time of our next seminar. We appreciate you being here. Rich, I appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.